welcome to the Empty Chair, Keeping the Mind in Mind. My name is Previn Karian. Now, if you've just landed on this video, please make sure you check out the introductory video to this channel's objectives, as well as the video on misogyny and Jung's shadow. If you can work through the previous videos, you should be able to get the best out of this content. So in the next couple of videos, I want to talk about one of the two psychological drives in heterosexual masculinity that come from the founder of psychotherapy and the founder of all the talking therapies, and that is Sigmund Freud. Now, I'm aware there's a lot of Freud hate and Freud disinformation out there, so I will be making a couple of videos on his methodology, and that will also include a couple of the things that he got wrong. But for now, I want to look at Freud's two drives of sadism and masochism, not just as psychological forms of sexual pleasure in heterosexual men, but as psychological drives that are present in misogyny. So the focus for the next few videos is going to be on sadism and masochism operating in misogyny. And this video is going to start with sadism. Now, I obviously couldn't fit everything into one video, so there will be a part 2 to sadism, which is, of course, a huge topic. And whilst sadism and masochism as psychological drives obviously also apply to women, my focus here is purely on heterosexual men who can't find the ability to reflect on our shadow psychology. And that inability, that incapacity, leaves us way behind women in our emotional and psychological development. And that doesn't particularly help us. But I want to remind you of the disclaimer that words like inferiority, sadism, and masochism are not labels to throw as accusations at heterosexual men. We have a problem of violence, abuse, suffering, and phenomenal levels of destruction that are specifically caused by men. So words like inferiority, sadism, and masochism, which I'm using as key psychological identifiers, are here to help men understand our part in bringing destruction and pain into the world. And as heterosexual men, we do a lot of that, as we can all see if we look around at the geopolitics of the world in 2025. There's a growing saturation of economic, institutional, and military violence and injustice right across the planet, and it affects everyone. We also know about torture, rape, and physical abuse that goes on in wars and military prisons as part of army policy and practice, all the way to private acts of rape, torture, and murder committed by individual heterosexual men on women. So it's not a complicated, controversial observation to make. Heterosexual male psychology contains and acts out violence and destruction on a scale and in a specific sadistic manner unparalleled by any other animal on the planet. The novelist Dostoevsky said that man was different to animals because our capacity for cruelty was actually an art. A conscious, calculated, intentional art of creating maximal pain in a trapped victim, from which we derive some kind of mental and aesthetic pleasure. Now, this psychological state of sadism does not describe the behavior of all men all of the time, but it does describe a component of heterosexual male shadow psychology. And the key in sadism that forms our shadow psychology is to find a weaker object to be sadistic towards. So if women could physically beat up men, we would clearly not have the ability to torture, rape, murder, or humiliate them. So heterosexual men have a very specific psychological relationship to weaker people, which we can naturally find in women. I mean, we can't even find equality amongst each other. So there's no chance we can find it naturally with women. So that locates the problem as a psychological one. It takes an incredible psychological toughness and mental strength to look at our own psychological shadow as heterosexual men. Carl Jung thought it required moral courage. Well, I hope you can find whatever strength you need to think about this shadow psychology content in heterosexual men. I'll be making a central distinction in my use of the term sadism. General sadism is the compulsion for death, destruction, abuse, and violence that we find in social organization generally. And I will be opening that up in my videos on fascism. So that general sadism is really about economic and military sadism. But in this video, I want to focus on a narrower form of sadism that we find in misogyny and its key psychological identifiers. The difference between general sadism in heterosexual men and sadistic misogyny is the element of sexual arousal, sexual desire, and erotic fixation in cruelty and pain inflicted on women. So, how do we get there if we're supposed to be civilized men? And that's the guiding question for these videos. So again, please use these psychological terms to help us to think, to step back, and to reflect on how we as heterosexual men can do things differently and live a little differently, and not least with women. And please also remember, I can't cover every aspect of this in 2 videos. These are very introductory to get us thinking about the core of the problem of violence directed at women. In addition to Jung's model of inferiority, we need to get through both of Freud's drives that live in the shadow psychology of heterosexual men. And that will help us to get a more complete picture of what men do in misogyny. So this includes a sexual, erotic, or pleasure element of creating pain and humiliation, or watching and acting out the abuse and death of women. And as we think about all of this, I hope this helps my argument that misogyny is a psychological disorder that is deeply embedded in men. But it is also something that can be worked through with psychological reflection to understand what we can do with this drive. In my previous videos, I've talked about the shadow psychology of men and explained the basic model of mind that is used in psychoanalysis. This model is based on the conflict between the conscious ego functioning of the heterosexual male and our unconscious contents, which is the psychological space of our repressed shadow. Emotions such as fear, anger, shame, rage, rejection, sexual desire, and sexual fantasies in men, all of these get split off from our conscious ego thinking. And those emotional contents get repressed or pushed down because we have to function socially and economically, and because we have to function with women if we're going to get our emotional and sexual needs met. So this splitting off of our emotions, memories, and desires are pushed down and repressed into an unconscious shadow space, which we try to hold down and ignore or deny it's even there. But this unconscious shadow content erupts and disrupts our relationships with women, as well as other people close to us. So the content of our unconscious that our egos try to split off from and forget are actually always present and ready to erupt into our daily lives, because those contents are actually alive complexes in our unconscious. We can now be more specific with how these repressed emotions, memories, and desires all start to break out into psychological drives of sadism and masochism. In misogyny, these contents come out as our hurt, our anger, our spite, as well as our losses and rejections, which are all wrapped up and projected into our desire for women. And these unconscious contents also produce our rage at women when they don't gratify and appease those psychological desires, hurts, and needs. So these emotions and memory contents are created in men through everyday life, our fortunes and misfortunes with women, from our mothers, sisters, and early attractions and rejections with girls and women. So these contents are just sitting there in our unconscious mental space, slowly accumulating in their force and charge, because they are just our individual narratives with what happened to us with women. It is when those narrative contents connect with the two psychological drives that we find in sadism and masochism that we get those types of misogyny. So our repressed emotions, memories, and desires are not the two psychological drives. Those contents are just the ingredients or chemicals that accumulate into a deadly mixture in our minds, ready for the explosion of sadistic misogyny or masochistic misogyny, when those contents connect with two drives. So here is Freud's definition of the two drives. You can find it in his 3 essays on sexuality, written in 1905. He defines sadism as an active or violent attitude or cases in which satisfaction is entirely conditional on the humiliation and maltreatment of the object. And he defined masochism as nothing more than an extension of sadism turned round upon the subject's own self. So let me read those again. Sadism is an active or violent attitude or cases in which satisfaction is entirely conditional on the humiliation and maltreatment of the object. And masochism is nothing more than an extension of sadism turned round upon the subject's own self. So sadism is pain inflicted externally on other people who become psychological and, of course, physical objects. Masochism is pain inflicted internally on oneself. For Freud, both these drives are present in any individual. However, one drive becomes dominant over the other. And this psychologically leaves you either sadistic towards other people or masochistic towards yourself, we can extend this to our working definition of the two drives in misogyny. Sadism characterizes external misogyny, which is pain inflicted on the external object, where the external object is women. Masochism characterizes internal misogyny, which is pain inflicted at oneself because of women in order to please them or keep them. Now, clearly there's an enormous amount to break down here, which I may actually put together as an online course, but let's briefly get started with an overview of sadism and sadistic misogyny. The terms sadism and masochism originally came from the names of two European novelists and short story writers in Europe. One was the Marquis de Sade, who was writing during the French Revolution, and the other was Leopold Sacher Masoch, who was a member of the Austrian aristocracy. Obviously, I'll talk about masochism in a separate series of videos. And this one is just a part one on sadism. So let's start with the Marquis de Sade. Sade's novels were about the sexual torture, rape, and humiliating orgies, incest, and sexual transgression with women, but especially young girls. It provided pornography for his aristocratic readers and an apparently liberal philosophy in which nature had no rules or laws. Sadism is derived from his name. Sade's insight into heterosexual male psychology is the connection between pain and the pleasure that creates as a sexual or erotic excitement. If you want to skip all of his novels, you can go to his short piece called Conversation Between a Priest and a Dying Man to get his main argument. And what he argues is that the force of nature in man is greater than any law of goodness, kindness, or virtue. Human life may oscillate or move between these two forces, but nature always wins. And nature is positively immoral, predatory, ruthless, self-justifying, self-gratifying, and a power that extorts whatever it wants from the weak. Sade's psychological insight here is that there is something sexually or erotically arousing to a part of the heterosexual male psychology, the male brain, when we inflict pain, torture, and physical humiliation onto a weaker object, which we find in women. This is why I talk about the human male as a separate species with a unique brain in the animal kingdom, because of its capacity and psychological need for pleasure derived from cruelty and violence towards weaker others within its own biological kinship group. The psychology of sadism in Sade's novels is very much the Andrew Tate baseline, and it's driven by the need for a weaker object, usually found in young girls or submissive women. And this weakness of others is crucial to the male psyche in sadistic psychology and sadistic misogyny. Sadistic heterosexual men need a weaker person because they can't feel superior, strong, or masculine without the weakness of others. But this comes from a place of psychological inferiority, which obviously links with the previous videos on Carl Jung. So sexual sadism excites and arouses psychologically weak heterosexual men who are operating from their inferiority, because it is the only strength that this type of heterosexual male has. But for sadistic men, this feels like it's completely natural, as if it's part of our biologically defined nature to behave sadistically and experience strength superiority and an erotic, sexual, or pleasurable arousal and excitement from it. So for the Marquis de Sade, you can never change these men. Now, that was generally the content of de Sade's novels. Nature wins. The sadistic drive is the nature of men. The weak exist to be extorted and exploited as slaves to appease the sadistic world of heterosexual men. So to understand the world of sadistic misogyny, we need to take a step back and understand sexuality as a psychological function and not merely a biological one. Now, this is going to need a detour through Charles Darwin and the early European sexologists who formed the background to Freud's two drives. So the question then is whether sadistic misogyny is a purely sexual and natural fact of heterosexual men, or does it have a psychological location? Now, as we're about to see in Freud's model of the drives, it involves both. So fast forward from the Marquis de Sade to the world of man defined by Charles Darwin. Darwin's evolutionary model saw individual biological drives geared up purely for survival. He did not think of biological evolution as kinship group cooperation based on relationship drives for teamwork and coexistence with each other in our kinship group. That model was not in his mind. But that alternative view was put forward by Peter Kropotkin, researching at the same time as Darwin, and it has been revived more recently by E. Owen Wilson. For those of you who want more detail than I can give here on Freud's Darwinian background, I highly recommend Frank Soloway's Freud, Biologist of the Mind, which I base a lot of this video on. So, as industrial society developed in Europe, so too did the view that our individual biological needs to satisfy sex and hunger were also psychological drives constructed in our minds. The biological became psychological. And those psychological structures determined how we behave to get those needs met. So the idea of a drive was a biopsychological idea where biology and mind were almost inseparably connected together. But if we were biologically determined, why didn't we all have the same type of sexuality and sexual preferences? A group of sexologists tried to explain what was viewed as sexual abnormality, sexual deviation, and sexual malfunctioning. Why were some people homosexual or lesbian, or overtly sadistic or masochistic, or enjoyed sexual transgression and perversions? All of these sexualities were viewed as sexually abnormal at the time. But this meant that normality was assumed to be defined in binary terms of male and female, within which all sexual attraction should occur. Any other type of sexuality was criminal and forbidden. And this was roughly what early sexologists had to confront. The key figures at that time were Havelock Ellis, Albert Moll, and Richard von Krafft-Ebbing, and Freud was responding to all of their works. Their studies were profound in its social consequences, and we'll see how sexology and psychoanalysis broke away from punishing social conventions and along with the literary world, made a huge contribution to democratic societies that allowed individuals to live in their psychological sexual orientations. But they also helped to differentiate between sexual identity and criminal sexuality. The starting point of understanding sexuality for these sexologists was the development of the human embryo. Formed in the first 8 weeks before it becomes a fetus, the embryo goes through a stage of undefined sexual anatomy in which both male and female genitalia appear without being fully formed. So this was not a chromosomal observation about sexual identity. This was an observation of embryonic physical development. The embryo then grows into one or the other set of genitalia, but sometimes can possess characteristics of both in what we call biologically intersexed people. These physical developmental stages were then applied to our psychological development. If the fetus had to grow into its genitalia to achieve sexual identity, perhaps our psychologies also had to grow into their sexual identities. This meant that from childhood to adolescence, bisexuality and homosexuality were early and intermediate stages before we all achieve our heterosexual identity, when one set of genitalia becomes physically dominant or determined. So if biology was broadly universal across all civilizations, then could psychology also be the same? This was roughly the position of the key sexologists Ellis, Moll and Krafft-Ebbing, and it was profound in its social consequences. For the first time in the West, bisexuality or homosexuality were not abnormal, sexually deviant or perverse, but part of everybody's psychological development. We develop into heterosexuality, and some of us may not develop into heterosexual sexuality. And if this was true, it was then criminal of society to criminalize these sexual orientations and sexual identities because society was attacking the psychology of a person. And it's taken over a century for Western societies to decriminalize these sexualities. And we are still not there yet. Freud took over from these findings to develop the psychological model much further. After all, Ellis and Krafft-Ebbing were just describing sexual identity outcomes. When a mother wrote to Freud about curing her homosexual son, Freud replied that the question that really interested him the most was, how do we become heterosexual, rather than how do we cure homosexuals? And he advised her to accept her son's sexuality as his developmental condition and sexual identity. Notice that this was not a matter of gender, but of sexuality as a psychological condition, which is a crucial distinction to understand in sexual identity formation, particularly in the trans debates. It is also important in understanding the psychology of sadistic misogyny, where women are the sexual object for heterosexual men. So deviations, perversions, and abnormalities as sexual behaviors were not important to Freud. Understanding how the human mind achieved sexual identity and what was happening with our libido, that was his lifelong inquiry. If Ellis, Krafft-Ebbing, and the sexologists had established that sexual identity was about psychological development rather than gender choices that could be cured, then a variety of sexual activities, preferences, and orientations were possible, which were completely normal or natural to each individual. Freud broadly agreed with their findings. Now, the next step that followed from all this was that human sexuality, sexual attraction, and sexual obsession was not then based on self-preservation or reproduction of the species, as Darwin had thought. Freud made a distinction between the sexual drive, the Sexualtrieb, and the genital drive, Geschlechtstrieb. Babies and toddlers respond to pleasure stimulation long before they have any awareness of genital identity. So the idea of pleasure stimulation, which Havelock Ellis called autoerotic, meant that excitation of our erogenous zones created a sexual characteristic, orientation, and sexual preference that forms in our emotional memory systems. These areas of pleasure stimulation and our memories of them last into pubescent, adolescent, and adult life. Sexual activity for pleasure and the stimulation of erogenous zones were now entirely different to sexual activity for reproduction and preservation of the species. This meant that the sexual attractions and obsessions in sadistic misogyny belong to autoerotic pleasure rather than biological reproduction. Although heterosexual men are biologically and chemically attracted to women, sadistic misogyny part belongs to a psychological autoerotic pleasure. So the way heterosexual men get attracted to women or objects that represent women, which is really important in understanding pornography or fetishism, it's not based on a biological need for reproduction, but a psychological need for sexual pleasure and erotic stimulation. And that pleasure will be based on our emotional memory systems. And perhaps you can now see how biopsychologically disadvantaged heterosexual men are in our relationships with women. We are not wired for relationships and cannot help turning women into psychological objects for pleasure, strength, and superiority. And this becomes extreme in sadistic misogyny, where women are objects that gratify and bring pleasure to the sadistic drive. So the differences in how men choose women depends on our emotional memory bank, which triggers an intensification of sexual and erotic urges, as well as what makes us feel superior, strong, and safe. So what does all this mean? Our emotional memory banks are a build-up of quantities of mental energy, and this creates a mental pressure that needs to be diffused or released. Heterosexual men get aroused into sexual tension and need to release that tension to regain a mental or psychological equilibrium or release. And when that tension is not released, we carry around an unpleasant tension which churns and accumulates into rage, anger, and aggression until we find a way to release it. We cannot repress the build-up of sexual tension, and the need for pleasure cannot be held back endlessly. It has to break out and erupt into sadistic or masochistic behavior. So we can now understand how sadistic misogyny becomes a psychological state in Freud's model rather than just a description of terrible behaviors in men or anything to do with biological reproduction. If sadistic misogyny is where women in pain and humiliation gets connected with pleasure, then we are not dealing with a biological necessity, but a psychological necessity, a mental pressure to behave sadistically. And this mental pressure acquires its energy in our unconscious mind, which our egos just cannot see. So let's revisit what Freud said in his 3 essays on sexuality about sadism. An active or violent attitude, or cases in which satisfaction is entirely conditional on the humiliation and maltreatment of the object. Psychologically, the key word here is satisfaction. When heterosexual men are sadistic towards women, it is because they gain a mental satisfaction or pleasure in inflicting pain on a weaker object. The woman is no longer a human being with a will, requiring relationship skills and interaction. Sadistic misogyny is an acting out of tension and aggression that is built up in our unconscious mind. And it forms into a permanent behavior, a mentally stuck attitude. Now, it obviously has many causes to explain how it gets there in each individual man. And that depends on every individual's personal narrative. It could be rejection from other women, difficult relationships with our mothers, chronic and continuous failures in school, finance and work, poor role models that create and support an environment of sadistic misogyny. And of course, not knowing what to do with an unhappy marriage or relationship, especially when there are children involved. Any or all of these can activate our inferiority, which then needs to find superiority. But when the solution to all these relationship problems is sadistic, we are deriving a peculiar form of pleasure as a mental satisfaction, to use Freud's word, in the moment. It's a satisfaction that we want to repeat again and again. A satisfaction that becomes a dominant drive. So the main point I want to make here is that when heterosexual men are sadistic towards women, along the whole spectrum of verbal, mental or emotional abuse, all the way through to violent domestic abuse, sexual abuse, or the criminal abuse of rape and murder, we are dealing with a psychological event that is a build-up of mental pressure which we act out on a weaker object that we find in women. As I said before, if women could physically beat heterosexual men up, there would not be a single man who raped a woman. Heterosexual men rely on the physical, emotional, or financial weakness of a woman in order to become sadistic towards them. But the need to do that is psychological. And that's why in sadistic misogyny, heterosexual men struggle with strong, successful, or secure women. We now get into a lot of nuance and differentiation to peel back how the many sadistic actions of heterosexual men are psychological forms of release that give them mental satisfaction and an erotic sexual form of pleasure. That is for the next video. But to do it justice, it actually would take a whole course which would include the work of Melanie Klein. However, for now, sadism towards women in acts of humiliation that are verbal, sexual or physical abuse, rape and murder is a psychological factor. even though it is deeply connected to our biologies and our brains and our anthropology, all of which are separate videos. The psychological aspect is the defining one, the one that makes the decisions in behavior. The psychological drive is why misogyny keeps repeating in heterosexual men. Once we understand sadism towards women as psychological, we can then do something about it. Step back from those needs and those drives and choose differently. I'll deal with that in the next video, though of course it can't be a comprehensive video. It is just an introduction to thinking about some solutions. Sadism is one of two drives in the shadow psychology of heterosexual men that contributes to misogyny. When it locks in with our inferiority, we have an explosive cocktail of psychologically determined needs for violence, humiliation, and destruction waiting to erupt from our civilized conscious egos. It ends in the failure of our relationships with women, as well as with socially significant others. Sadistic misogynists need weaker, compliant, and submissive women who are no longer human beings, but objects that satisfy our psychological drives for pain. Women become psychological objects that bring us pleasure, strength, and safety. The women we choose in sadistic misogyny must only live for the gratification of our drives. Sadistic misogyny as a psychological drive is not the same as the sexual objectification of women in pornography. It is a much more predatory capture of a human being who is turned into a psychological object. Women become objects whose very existence triggers, fulfills, and gratifies the sadistic drive of men. And this has nothing to do with narcissism. It is much, much deeper. It's a brain-wired, biopsychological drive which we can only escape or diminish through personal psychological reflection. It is what Freud called a mental satisfaction, just like hunger that can only be satisfied with its food. I briefly want to mention at this point that when men stay with women who are sadistic towards them, we are dealing with a masochistic drive, which of course will take another couple of videos to explain after these two on sadism. But let's not lose the analytic focus here on sadistic heterosexual men. Sadistic misogyny in society is a problem that will increase because the inferiority of men is increasing. From heterosexual boys to heterosexual men, we are realizing that we don't have the wiring or the psychology to relate to women or to life. We turn almost everything we touch into objects for our pleasure and manipulation. And sadistic misogyny is the psychological root formation of what feminists have called patriarchy, social systems for men to feel superior when they are not, and a mental, psychological incapacity to understand what equality or justice actually mean. We have no psychological understanding of what is happening to us as heterosexual men, psychologically. We don't get life. And the labels that feminism or psychiatry has come up with to describe us such as patriarchal, entitled, narcissistic, autistic, don't come close to the experience of who we are as men and how much we struggle to have a connection with life, with women, and most importantly, even with ourselves as men. We don't know who we are. We can't be honest with each other. And it is difficult for our egos to see what we are doing, how actually lost we are on the planet while we conquer and rape everything in it. So in this video, I've tried to open up 2 drives from Freud's 3 essays on sexuality, focusing on the sadistic drive. I've applied Freud's model to get an understanding of a type of misogyny which we can now specify as sadistic misogyny. The Marquis de Sade made the connection between erotic or sexual pleasure and humiliation or violence towards women as a psychological fact, a psychological compulsion in heterosexual men. This psychological drive in heterosexual men is reinforced by our biological brain wiring, which does not have the capacity to withstand or manage the forces of these drives when they erupt from our unconscious shadow psychology. All of this requires a psychological perspective if we're going to find any psychological solutions. So we need to understand that the unconscious shadow psychology of heterosexual men searches for a weak object. And we find it in women, where we can act out sadistic behaviors for a mental satisfaction, a release of built-up tension, and a pleasure in that release, which becomes a repetition compulsion. We justify this pleasure to ourselves as if it's biologically natural. When we follow our sadistic and predatory drives, we search for objects to possess, control, and own, rather than create relationships with women as human beings. The woman becomes an object that is owned rather than related to. If those women grow strong, independent, and successful, they disrupt the sadistic superiority of heterosexual men. But the superiority of men who live through a sadistic drive, of which they have no idea because it lives in their unconscious, and whose egos cannot see the drive, are actually based on a profound psychological inferiority. This psychological inferiority is not about women, but about life. In sadistic misogyny, women are just objects through whom heterosexual men are acting out our psychological inferiority about life itself. But that really is for a later video when I wrap up the connection between inferiority and Freud's 2 drives. So I hope you'll join me in the next video on sadism to dive deeper into the sadistic drive in heterosexual men. Please like, share and subscribe, and please donate to protect the independence of the project. Hopefully, see you soon.